In September 2004, my family and I were about to get into our car outside the pizza restaurant where we had lunch when a funeral procession passed in front of us, with several people by foot, carrying a coffin, and a few others walking behind. We lived then in Peru, specifically in Trujillo City, where people still had the habit of doing some of these practices by foot, especially in the blocks near the location where the funeral would take place, despite temporarily stopping the traffic of an avenue. My daughter Magdita, then 4 years old, asked me what was going on, and I replied that it was the funeral of a person who had died. She asked me if a dead person was inside the coffin, and I answered affirmatively. Everything stayed there. She got in the car, and we started talking about other things as naturally as ever. A year before, my daughter had already had the experience of the death of her second little brother, Carlos Alberto, who had been born prematurely at 6 months of gestation. At that time, my wife and I had long conversations with her about the subject, after which she seemed to have calmed down. The next night, my wife, my 2 children, and I were coming home from shopping when we remembered we had a rented movie videotape to deliver. I parked the car outside the house, and my wife got out to get what we had to return. Meanwhile, my little Magdita, her little brother, Juan Carlos, and I remained inside the vehicle, which I left with the engine running. Suddenly, I saw my daughter's facial expression change. "Dad, am I going to die?" she asked me with a panicked look. "No. Why do you think you are going to die if you are very well?" I answered, still not realizing what was coming. "No, but later, when I'm old, I'm going to die, right?" Her eyes were beginning to fill with tears, and her piercing gaze seemed intent on hooking into my brain and wresting the answer she needed from me by whatever means possible. Many years ago, I had ceased to have a conscious fear of death or had evaded it, except when landing and taking off at the airport in the windy and very high city of Juliaca, next to Lake Titicaca. The fact is that some 15 years before, when I did not consider myself a believer, I used to express my evasion on the subject with the phrase, "Only those who have not lived well fear death." Later on, once my faith returned, death became a simple step, an opportunity to reach glory, and a call to live correctly and intensely. I began to worry more about the reason for life than that for death. It's a girl, I thought. So, I must tell her the truth, but with the right words. Well, yes, but that's a long way off. So, you must live well and be good to go to heaven. I replied with the false assurance that this answer would close the matter. But how? She insisted. What do you mean by how? I started to hesitate. And my wife did not show up, as usually happens when someone says she or he will go into the house just to pick something up and be right back. So, I started to talk to her about the resurrection, God's promises, and all the things I remembered from the catechesis I received in my childhood, but I did not convince her. She started crying harder. She would ask me between screams if she would go to heaven with her body and, if so, what was the reason for locking the body in a coffin and burying it. I continued to pretend to explain my beliefs and faith to her, but it was clear that I was not sufficiently prepared to do so. Later, I tried vainly to remember something that would have remained in my mind from philosophical positions, but I did not find words to reassure my daughter. Finally, she released the loudest and most intense scream, which left me paralyzed, more by the sentence's content than by the volume. "I don't want to die," she yelled. And she repeated it over and over again. Clearly, the situation was not the same as when her brother died. This time, she had become aware of her imminent death, her own death, not that of others. I understood it was useless to try to convince her at that moment on matters I did not fully understand. By then, my youngest son, Juan Carlos, had started to cry, too, accompanying his sister. So instead, I tried to reassure my daughter by hugging her and repeating that I loved her very much and would stay with her. Little by little, her screams changed to slight sobs, and silence returned inside the car while I watched as my wife returned happily after those minutes that, for me, were eternal. Over the next few days, my wife and I went through books with titles such as What to Tell Your Child About, which suggested what to say to children in the event of the death of a parent, grandmother, or pet, but in none of the books consulted did we see a suggestion for when the children's concern was their own death. What we did learn is that, according to these texts, what children under the age of 7 fear most about death is the very fact of separation from their parents, from other people or from the animals which they would have lived with, and they are not so worried about ceasing to exist, something that could be purely abstract, philosophical, and alien to the thinking of their age. So, for the next few days, we told our daughter that we would always be together and showed her much love. Peace reigned again, and we lived quietly, although we were sure she still had many doubts. About 6 months later, during Holy Week 2005, we had the opportunity to discuss the issue again. In kindergarten, my daughter attended a reenactment of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, or Palm Sunday, and she became very interested in the story that we would remember for the rest of the week. We attended some religious celebrations that, although she did not bear very well, were the ideal pretext to tell her, in advance at home, what happened with Jesus. Fortunately, as usual, at this time, Peruvian television was saturated with movies like Ben-Hur, Demetrius and the Gladiators, as many other ancient Rome movies, followed by Old Testament classics like the Ten Commandments and films about life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. My daughter and I watched almost all the movies. With the beautiful few special effects of the old productions, she got a clearer idea, without gimmicky lighting or loud sounds, of what we meant by resurrection and going to heaven, especially how Jesus had defeated death. We completed those film sessions with long talks in which my wife and I tried to explain to her the great content of those events. Finally, my daughter seemed convinced, which I partly attributed to the fact that she was already 6 months older and perhaps had a better ability to understand these concepts. Not long after, and still celebrating Easter Sunday, I bought a telescope, practically a toy, to see the full moon on those dates. The whole drive home was one of mounting excitement. Everyone in the family was looking forward to seeing through the telescope. With Magdita, I used to see the stars and point her out some constellations. She was always attentive and interested, which used to hearten me more. On this occasion, my daughter asked me if there was life in the stars and if we could see other people in the stars with the telescope. I wanted to give her a scientific explanation without removing her understandable curiosity, so I told her that we had not yet detected life outside of Earth, but that did not mean it did not exist. She insisted again. Then, no one has been seen living up there? Not yet, I replied briskly, trying to inject enthusiasm into her and not realizing what she was understanding. We got home and set up the telescope. We wait for the night. By 7 in the evening, even with some light in those latitudes, my daughter mixed her enthusiasm with the delicious sleepiness of children her age. Finally, darkness came, and I got ready to focus on a star since the moon would still take a little longer to appear. The chosen star was Sirius, in the Canis Major constellation, recognized as the most luminous star. I never imagined how difficult it would be to focus or even catch it in the small scope of the telescope. As soon as I moved the device a little, I lost the star. After spending a few minutes trying to focus, I achieved my goal. Obviously, due to the smallness of the telescope and the distance from the star, its vision in the eyepiece was the same as that obtained without a telescope, just a tiny dot. I invited my daughter to see it, and before doing so, she asked me if I had seen people living on the star. I said no. Then she told me she was tired and would leave the telescope for another day. She entered the house and went up to her room, where my wife was waiting for her to bathe before putting her to sleep. Then I heard the crying and the desperate phrases. I assumed the outcry was because my daughter's sleepiness was so much that she opposed the bath. I kept trying in vain to get a better view of the telescope, and time passed until I stopped hearing the crying. I entered the house and looked at my tired wife. Magdita wants me to promise that we're going to die together, my wife told me. Well, what did you say to her out there? But I thought, what did I do? Then I thought I finally understood what was going through my daughter's mind. If the good guys went to heaven after they died, why was not anyone up there living in heaven? She surely thought of the loneliness she would feel in that heaven after her death and, therefore, she wanted to make sure to go accompanied. Years later, Magdita told me that her crying that night began when she hit an uninstalled basketball backboard that was temporarily on the floor as she walked toward her mother. Regardless of the above, from then on, one thing would be paradise, and another would be the firmament, sky, or space. In our house, we would bypass the use of the word heaven to avoid confusion between religious and purely astronomical meanings. However, I decided to study and investigate more about the reason why we kept using the same word, heaven, for expressing two apparent so different concepts.